Hello, everybody. Today's talk is Mahfouz and Darwish from National Literature to World Literature. Actually, I delivered a talk on this subject in my participation in the first Congress of the World Literature Association from the 30th of June to the 3rd of July 2011. That was the first academic conference on world literature, and it was held in Beijing under the title The Rise of World Literature. And actually, there were some key scholars participated in that conference, like David Damrosch, Spivak, and also Professor Zhang Longxi. And it was very short talk because each scholar was given like 15 minutes, 12 to 15 minutes, something like that. So it was a short talk. But last year, I was asked, while I was teaching at Lingnan University, I was asked to give a talk in research seminar series. So I used the same topic, but I developed it, and the talk was for almost more than 1.5 hours, almost 2 hours. So today's talk will be a little bit long, so I will try to divide it into 3 parts. The first part will try to give an introduction, a very brief introduction to world literature. What is world literature? The second part will talk about Mahfouz and his novels and how his literature was moved from national literature to be or to become world literature, and the same with Mahmoud Darwish in the third part. So let me start with the first part. World literature. What is world literature? What do we mean when we say world literature? Does it mean these international bestsellers books? Definitely not. Does it mean that books are well accepted around the world? Does it mean that literature that's written in English, for example? What do we mean actually by world literature, and what do we mean by national literature? For example, does national literature have to focus on nationalism more than literature? What if there is a novel that really depicts the local life and local culture, but in terms of literature, it's not. We can't really consider it highbrow literature or good literature at all. And what is canonical literature? There are so many questions actually we will face when we come to think of world literature and national literature and so on. The first time the word world literature was used, the first time ever, that was in 1827 by Goethe, the German poet. Weltliteratur in German. He said, national literature is now rather an unmeaning term. The epoch of world literature is at hand. He prophesied the beginning of what he called at that time Weltliteratur, or world literature. The second time it was used, that term was used, was 21 years later in 1848 in the Communist Manifesto by Marx and Engels, where they said the international creations of individual nations become common property. And from the numerous national and local literature, there arises a world literature. We can see that from Marx and Engels' definition or introduction to world literature, or also prophecy of what will be later called as world literature, we can see that they refer to the writing or the literature of each nation, and also Goethe, also his definition or his talk of world literature also falls in the same line, that the sum of the literature written in any country, in any nation, or by any nation, all this together compromise or make up what what later we shall call world literature. So is that the idea? If we read American literature, English literature, French literature, Italian, and so on and so forth, African literature, Asian, Chinese, does it mean now we know about world literature? Or this world literature must have some certain specifications or features in order to be called world literature. Actually, towards the end of the 20th century and with the beginning of the 21st century, the interest in world literature was kindled, and there were some scholars around the world, especially in the Western world. Actually, they got interested in world literature, and they wrote books about it. Let us mention just three of them: Franco Moretti and his publication in 2000, David Damrosch, his publication in 2003, and Pascal Casanova. So one from Italy, one from America, one from France. And three of them, they had different approaches and different understanding, different definition of word literature, completely different approaches. Damrosch established the Journal of World Literature. And also in London-based Bloomsbury Publishing, launched a new book series called, the title of the book, whatever the book is, then as world literature. For example, Heart of Darkness as world literature, Things Fall Apart as world literature, and so on. And the idea was to examine this world literature and in terms of production, circulation, and reception, and so on. The reception also is very important, and what kind of work we can consider world literature after how many years of publishing that book we can say that this book is really world literature after passing the test of time. In 2003, Damrosch published his What is World Literature, a book called What is World Literature. In 2008, Chia wrote an essay, What is a Word? And then Damrosch in 2009, wrote another essay called What is Literature? And in 2016, What isn't World Literature? Another essay. And Thornberg in 2016 wrote What not in brackets, What not World Literature? Casanova, in her book, The World Republic of Letters, that was published in 2004. She said, The World Republic of Letters, that's the name of her book. Did I say The World Republic of Literature? Actually, the title of her book, The World Republic of Letters. She says, I quote, in page 146 from her book, The World Republic of Letters, it is plain that translation into French, owing to Paris' unique power of consecration, occupies a special place in the literary world, and the greatest English authors enjoyed truly universal recognition during the 18th and 19th centuries only through the translation of their writings into French. And of course, this is Casanova said so. And actually, she sheds light on the importance of translation. We know that the translation gave rise to comparative literature, and definitely translation is so important to world literature too. But how important is it? What if, for example, we read some works in their original language? If I read a word, I'm not an English native speaker, but if I read a novel in English, or if I read a novel in Chinese or in Russian, even though I am not Chinese and I'm not Russian and so on, is this work world literature to me? even here, I don't need translation at all. So if we say translation is so important to word literature, is it that important? What if I read the word in its original language right away without any need for translation? Franco Moretti, in 2000, he advocated what he called distant reading with the West as the center and the non-West as distant lands. Distant, something that reminds us of the l'autre of Edward Said's The Other. It's us and the other, and so the West in the center and the other, the non-West, distant reading. So he as distant lands. The West is in the center and the non-West as distant lands. So he called it distant reading. These three scholars, they applied three different methodologies and three different approaches. For example, both Moretti and Casanova, they both used sociological approaches, sociological methodology, while Damrosch used humanistic methodology, historical investigation, and close textual analysis. Damrosch defined word literature as, I quote, a mode of reading, a form of detached engagement with words beyond our own place and time. Somehow it's close also to what Moretti called distant reading. You are in the West and you read literature of distant lands, so it's distant readings. And here Damrosch say it's a form of detached engagement with worlds beyond our own place and time. And actually he wrote an excellent, wonderful book called Gilgamesh, on the epic Gilgamesh. So it's not only beyond our place, but also beyond our time. So word literature, do we only mean mainly Western literature? Western literature read and translated by non-Western readers and non-Western writers. What Damrosch and Moretti said earlier actually goes against that, because it's not only Western literature that should be considered word literature, and also it's the same meaning of what Goethe and Marx and Engels said before, that the writing of each nation, if we take the canonical literature of each nation, the sum of all this writing can be considered world literature. So it's not we should not look at Western literature only as word literature. No, it should go beyond that. So Damrosch redefined the center-periphery relationship between the West and the rest of the world in terms of translation and reading. And he shed light here on the importance of translation, that translation adds meaning and gives extra dimension to the original text, and that the original text gains in translation. We may also ask about the difference between comparative literature and word literature. Well, comparative literature, we can tell from the title, it focuses more on comparison between different texts from different languages. David Damrosch says word literature is the body of texts that gains in translation. So here Damrosch puts great importance on translation for the word. Although without translation the work will not be word literature. course, translation is so important. Translation indeed gave rise to world literature and to comparative literature too. So translation is so important, whether you read it in the original language or you read it translated. But for other people, for the mainstream, translation will be important to them, important for them to read the text. Italo Calvino, he says, a classic is a text that has never stopped saying what it has to say. If we have to define what classics are and what canonical works are, this definition is very interesting. That a classic is a text that has never stopped saying what it has to say. In each generation, there is something new we may discover in the classics. So, in other words, classics really, they passed the test of time. There are some works that they are famous only and get popularity only in a short span of time, during a certain time. After that time, then it's not famous anymore. Nobody. Yes. Davros says in his book, What is World Literature, in 2003, in page 6, he says, a work enters into world literature by a double process. First, by being read as literature. So it has to be considered literature first. The first thing, it should be literature, by being read as literature. Second, by circulating out into a broader world beyond its linguistic and cultural point of origin. As it moves into the sphere of world literature, far from inevitably suffering a loss of authenticity or essence, a work can gain in many ways. So while the work in translation loses some of its merits and values in the original language, it also gains some other merits and values in translation. To understand the workings of world literature, we need more a phenomenology than an ontology on the work of art. In the same book, in the introduction written by Sheldon says, instead of perceiving world literature as isolated books on the shelf, Damrosch considers world literature as texts that travel, texts that assume new lives, and texts that manifest differently in different geocultural contexts. In other words, to understand world literature is no longer to understand the sum total of all national masterpieces, but to understand how a work of art is opened up and reshaped by a world literary cultural exchange network. So what Damrosch wants to say here, it's not enough just to read works in different languages or written by different people from different cultures. What is important is to understand how this work is opened up, reshaped by a world literary cultural exchange network, how it's circulated, and why the people liked it in different nations. I remember in 2006, I think, or 2005, there was the International Man Literature Festival, the Hong Kong International Man Literature Festival, if I still remember the name correctly. And one of the key guests invited was Toby Eden. Toby Eden, one of the most famous literary agents in the UK. He tells his story of how he published The Wild Swan. That he said that one day a Chinese lady came into his office, offered him the manuscript of The Wild Swan. He read the manuscript and he liked it, and he decided to find a way to publish it as an agent. And of course, it was written by a Chinese lady, so in terms of the language, it was not ready yet. So he gave it to an English editor to work on it. after the first editor finished his work, Toby Eden still didn't like the final outcome. He gave it to a second editor, and still, after finishing his work on editing and everything, he was not happy with the outcome. He gave it to a third editor, and then a fourth editor, a fifth editor. He said 6 editors worked on the manuscript. Only after the work of the 6th editor was he satisfied with the outcome, and he started to approach publishers to publish the book. The book was published first in England and then America, but it was not successful at all in England at the beginning, and it was not successful in America either. But when he published it in Australia, it became national bestseller in Australia right away. And that drew the attention of the English and American readers, who started to read the book again, and influenced by the success in Australia, they received that influence, and they liked the book, and the book became international bestseller. This tells us how editing is so important, and how the success of the book in one part of the world can influence the other parts of the world. This is exactly the same also with Arabian Nights. Arabian Nights in the Arab world was not considered really, a highbrow literature at all, because it was written in a language that's not eloquent. But when it was translated into French first, and it became what we now call international bestseller, and then it was translated later into Italian and English and other languages, European languages, and that drew the Arabs' attention to Arabian Nights, and they started to read it again, and they started to discover its merits and literary values. And almost all, or most of the great novelists in our modern time were influenced one way or another by the Arabian Nights. So it's so important not just to read a text in its original language or translated, but it's important also to see how it was read in different parts of the world, and how the success of that book in one part of the world influenced its success in other parts. Zhang Longxi, Professor Zhang Longxi, he wrote an essay called The United Nations of World Literature, The United Nations of Great Books, in which he poses the question how to decide what canonical works are. And he also poses another question: should the canonical work be representative of its time or different from its time? Like Tu Fu's poetry, for example, the great Chinese poetry, who was called poet historian because he described in his poetry all the great historical events of his time. So in order to consider a book canonical, should it be representative of its time or not? We will come to this point, and we'll see this point clearly when we discuss the works of Naguib Mahfouz, because some of his works are really excellent depiction of the Egyptian society and Egyptian life, especially of the beginning of the 20th century. The beginning of the 20th century, that society, Mahfouz described it perfectly, and also the second part of the world literature. So actually, when we speak of world literature, there are other factors that should be taken into consideration, like translation, political, social, cultural factors. All this should be taken into account to see why a certain book should be considered world literature while another book should not. And so we need a continued evaluation of the literary output and its translation in order to define all the factors behind it. So translation is, now I'm trying to wrap up this talk. Translation is the primary path. First, as Damrosch said, the first two processes. The first thing is to consider it literature, to read it as literature. The second is to be translated and to see how it was spread circulated in the world. Word literature is writing that gains in translation, as David Damush said. Word literature in national language. To demonstrate national identity and culture in word literature to the extent that national literature can affect word literature. The example of Naguib Mahfouz again is excellent example. He depicted national issues, depicted the life in Egypt, described everything local, the culture local, but through that national literature, he gained word recognition. So he demonstrated this national identity and national culture in his word literature. And also national literature as word literature, such as, for example, such as African word literature, Chinese word literature, Arabic word literature. This national literature here refers to the writers who write in the language of their resident countries. Writing of like, for example, the Chinese writers, Chinese American writers who write in English, or Indian American writers, or Indians who live in England or wherever, African writers living abroad, and they write in Western languages, but they write about national issues. They write about the Chinese society, the African society, the Indian society, and so on and so forth, but in a different language. So, is it good enough for this to be considered, for these works to be considered word literature? I mean, is it enough for these works to be written in Western language to be considered word literature? This is also another thing that we should consider when we talk about word literature. But of course, I very much agree with David Damush that the first process should be, the text should be read as literature. I mean, it should be considered really literature, good quality of literature, in order we take it to the second level, because there are so many works that really distributed around the world, and they gained a great success and international bestsellers, but they are not literature at all, and everybody knows that. I don't need really to explain it. So finally, to finish part one of this talk, what is national literature? There are so many questions we raised, and it's difficult sometimes to find a clear-cut answer. What is national literature? What is word literature? Is literature defined by its language, or by the nationality of the author, or by the location of its publication? If I may take myself as an example, I'm originally from Egypt, but I wrote 3 novels in English, and those novels were published in Hong Kong. So, how should I consider these 3 novels? Are they Egyptian literature? But they are not in Arabic. And even though the first novel is set in Cairo, the second and the third novels set in China and Hong Kong, and the third novel, part of it in Cairo also. So should I consider it Egyptian literature or Arabic literature just because I am Egyptian? Or should I consider it English literature because they were written in English? Or should I consider them Hong Kong literature because they were published in Hong Kong with the support of ADC, Arts Development Council, which is similar to the Ministry of Culture in other countries? It's very difficult to really consider, to call it is it Egyptian, Chinese, Hong Kong, English? It depends on the theme or the language or the nationality of the writer, or what? Does national literature reflect more nationalism than literature, or does it have to reflect more nationalism than literature? And what if the national language changed over time? So in some countries, the national language itself changed. So here, Shall we consider the language written before that change, still national literature, or what? It changed from its local language to English, for example, taking English as a formal language. So shall we consider literature written in English, English literature, or Indian, or Chinese, or Singaporean, Malaysian, what? Is world literature the literature that travels across cultures? This point, Damrosch focused on this point. Is it just the literature that travels across culture? What if this literature is not really up to the standards, the required standards, not really good literature? So this should not be really the main criterion. What makes a particular text national literature and another text world literature? I talked about this point. Is the idea of world literature conceivable without translation? Is it conceivable at all without translation? And as I said earlier, what if I read a book in English right away? Should I consider, for me as a reader, should I consider it world literature? It's definitely world literature. If I read Shakespeare in English, Charles Dickens in English, they are world literature, even if I read them in English. But for this text to be considered world literature, or to enter the realm of world literature, they have to be translated first and to be read around the world. So translation is something it seems that we can't do without it. We can't do without translation. Translation gave rise to comparative literature. Translation gave rise to world literature. Translation gave rise to some civilization. The translation of Rosetta Stone gave rise to the ancient Egyptian civilization, and the depiction, the deciphering of the hieroglyphic language. And from then on, we discovered that there was something called Egyptian civilization that has literature and stories and poetry, and such a wonderful translation. Translation is so important, and we can't do without it. This is the end of the first part of the lecture. As I said, it's quite long, and I will keep talking now, but I'll give you a break, and I will start in part 2 right away. You soon.
فكر في واجبك كما تفكر في حقك، واعمل طلبا للإتقان لا طلبا للشهرة والجزاء، ولا تنتظر من الناس أكثر مما يحق للناس أن ينتظروه منك.